I'll make a quick announcement. So there will be a Q&A session at the end of the talk. So if you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand. And yeah, please make sure you introduce yourself and welcome everyone.
Great. Good afternoon. Before I get started, I want to state that this is a technical talk. A lot of the talks we've heard this week have been technical and non-technical, but challenge us to think about the work that I'm about to present and the work of my community as technical, but maybe not code. So the talk is maximizing the impact of user feedback, effective practices for community management. And the problem statement is that community managers and community management activities are built-in pathways for maximizing the impact of user feedback. So just we'll go over some strategies for gathering user feedback, some techniques for synthesizing and prioritizing your user feedback, methods for following up on user feedback, and then time for Q&A and discussion. So who am I? I'm Meg. I'm the Deputy Chief Experience Officer at the All of Us Research Program at the National Institutes of Health by Wandros. It's a mouthful, as is my fellowship with the Software Sustainability Institute, where I'm focused on usability practices in scientific software. And I've been an advisor on the user project by Superbloom with my colleagues here that we'll talk about a little bit later. So before we get into how of user research, I just want to talk about the why. So there's a technical name for the absence of user research: guessing. So just to level set here, we talk a lot about user research as an activity, but it comes in many forms. You don't need a PhD in behavioral science to be able to interact with users, but there are some methods that I want to share with you all today to bring back to your communities. So some strategies for gathering user feedback. The first one should look really familiar for many people in the audience. GitHub issues are a source of feedback. I took this list by searching on Jupyter's list of open and includes the word UI. And often you'll see the answers, like the issue will be do the thing, but it sometimes is missing why I want this thing to happen. And that's what user research is about. It's finding about the why, about why somebody wants a particular feature, not necessarily just doing what the issue says. In my work at the National Institutes of Health, at the All of Us Research Program, we have a Jupyter Notebook-based environment where researchers come and leverage our health data. And we have hundreds of publications that are coming out of our program. So we've started to use publications to be a source of user feedback. So you can see here just from one short paragraph from a limitations section, we see issues about data missingness and lack of clarity around generalizability, and challenges with longitudinal data. So user experience is not always just about fixing the user interfaces or the code or the features. It could also be the support that you have, the documentation that you have, and the data if you're a data resource like we are. So this not only helps us communicate with our developers, but also helps us communicate with our scientific teams as they're prioritizing which data we want to get next. But shifting into sort of some of the UX domain, feedback methods often depend on what your question is. So passive feedback like GitHub issues or publications are really good if you have existing data that you want to look at and get started with. But oftentimes, if you're starting a new project, you may not have a user base, or you may have an adjacent user base. So just to go around the loop on Just Enough Research by Erica Hall, it really depends on what your questions are about that determines what method that you would use. And so we often hear, and I speak with a lot of research software engineers, interviews and surveys are a big way of collecting feedback, along with focus groups, or if you have community calls, it's another good way to really learn about your users. But if you want to learn about your product and you have questions about your product, then you're working more in competitive analysis. What are other people doing? What are the strengths and weaknesses of my product versus someone else's product? So this may be familiar if you're coming from a commercial background, but it's less apparent in some of the academic settings that I've been working in. And then design for the right reasons, depending on where you are in your understanding of a problem, will also determine the type of activities that you do. So at the beginning, we say, what are the problems to solve in these big exploratory spaces? But as you're building your project and you're gaining momentum and you have a community, make sure you're shifting in towards like honing that topic rather than creating new and more topics. So some techniques for synthesizing user feedback, synthesizing or prioritizing. I'm not a behavioral scientist, but we work with a lot of behavioral scientists who think about the way that we design software, the way that we design workflows is often in spirit of getting someone to do something, to do a behavior. And so if you're looking for other disciplines and other domains, consider what research happens in behavioral science. And this methodology by Matt Wallert is called the intervention design process. And it starts with some insight about your user problem. You're gathering information about why the why of the user problem. And then this pressure mapping in the middle is where you take your understanding of the problem and mapping it from the promoting pressures and the inhibiting pressures. So you can see the difference between if someone is at a particular moment to do a behavior, what's holding them back, and then what's driving them forward, and making sure you understand both sides of the equation. So you might have a really good intervention, but if there's a lot of drag on your user in some other way, you're going to want to have to fix those. If you've done UX work or been around it, you'll be familiar with personas and user journeys. Those are both tools for synthesizing and prioritizing your findings. And they're really good at any point in a project. There's no right number of how many you should have or what they should look like. But the idea is to create composite stories about the themes that come up in your user community. They're not meant to be, reflective of singular individuals. And you can see here on the left-hand side, Persona Mary from the Usable Tools project at Internews focuses on security, tools and software, and you can see goals and strengths are pretty standard things that you would include in a persona. But because their work is focused on threats, it's important to understand your audience and what they also might be experiencing for your context. So there's no, don't feel like there's some prescriptive way of doing personas. And then a customer journey map is also very helpful. I find when you have an existing project and you're trying to figure out where should I start prioritizing these issues, and you see the through line on the user journey map is really an emotional ride. So if you have users who can't, I can't think of a good example on the fly, but if they can't do something or they're really stuck or they're really frustrated in your product, it's a really good way to visualize the pain. And oftentimes, the line's not here, but there is a threshold where there's abandonment. If your experience is so bad, you might have the best data in the world, but if your experience is so bad, people are going to abandon. So knowing where your abandonment moments are probably the places that you want to start thinking about and acting on in your prioritization. This is also very good for sharing to your community and letting them know this is how we see the experience, this is how we are capturing the pain points and the gain points, and give them a chance to reflect back on what might be missing. So it's a great communication tool to various stakeholders, but it could be a great communication tool back to your community. And then probably a lot of product people in the room. The most important thing, it's not things, UX can't end at personas and user journeys. You want to take these insights that you find and start to prioritize them. RICE, we use RICE in my project. It's a pretty good prioritization measure of reach, impact, and confidence that something's going to change for the user experience, and then divided by effort. And this is where we start to develop a common language with our engineering team and other partners, technical partners, who are implementing the code to figure out what is the effort? What is it going to take to make these fixes happen? And then some methods for following up on user feedback. May be familiar, the community participation model by the Center for Scientific Collaboration and Community Engagement, the CSCCE. It's one of the harder acronyms, but they have a great community participation model. And the idea is once you start building an engine of user feedback and prioritization and people are clear about where the biggest pain points are and how you want to prioritize them, there's a way for you to move this community from hub and spoke of one person has the insights and everyone else is receiving them, but really this co-creation mechanism. So how can you put out an issue into the community that really needs a lot of help to co-create those answers? So success here is when we have a support hub, is when people start answering questions for each other. And there's no need for an intervention from your central place. But that doesn't just happen on its own. That is designed, and that's an activity. So if you're planning on building these types of communities, community managers, if you don't already have one, make sure that there's somebody who is moderating and helping guide that discussion. And that may mean people contributing to the threads. It may be being the connector and saying, hey, you have this problem over here, I know this person here, and bringing people together to answer those questions. But it doesn't happen on its own. And then sort of my final slide here is about keeping the ladder of participation in mind. I've come from Mozilla Open Science world, and we talk a lot about how we think about co-production and co-creation. And really, when you're when you're managing a community and you're looking at all of the issues that are coming towards you and what the community needs, it's really important to, as I said, create that like matrix, bi-directional communication with folks. So then you're not in this sort of like at the bottom of the ladder and you're just educating and putting things outward. Co-production and co-design is actually doing it with people. So I heard a quote yesterday of, oh, the core dev will do that. What would it look like if the core dev didn't have to do that? What if we were able to share some of the resources and the activities across open source projects? And I just want to close out by saying what's next in UX and scientific open source software. For reference, I gave my first talk on UX and scientific open source software last April 2022, and there were 0 attendees. I gave a talk last week and there were 12. I gave a talk this week and I don't know, it's 20, 30 something people. So I do want to thank you for being here, and I really want to talk more about this and see how we can use common language so that we're not just coming in with the answer of you have to do this thing or you're doing it wrong. What's important to me is that we're building tools that work for people already in roles, and we don't need to keep adding different roles and different specialties. So happy to talk more, but the project I'm excited to share about is by the Superbloom group. It's an initiative with Superbloom funded by the Sloan Foundation. And the questions, I'm part of the group with my colleagues, Errol and Katie, who are here. The core questions were how norms in academic, science, and open source working environments affect the choices teams make around their users. So pretty much the questions that I've been asking and answering intuitively, these folks got a grant to start actually doing some interviews and understanding how team dynamics and trust affects those choices, and then what teams would need it to be interested in or able to prioritize usability and design in their work. So you all are definitely of the audience of people who would be consuming these findings. So I think Katie and Errol have zines. This is the first page of the zine. If you are interested, we'll be right outside the door after the talk to talk a little bit about where we can go next. And I think that's the end of my slides, but I have a reverse Q&A, which is like, what do you all think? I'm happy to know if there are methods or any ideas that are holding you back, or methods that you think I should include in future talks. And then if there's anybody in community management to talk about like what is the intersection between community management and user experience in your perspective, and then any other curiosities you might have. But yeah, like I said, please feel free to reach out to myself. Errol, Katie will be outside the doors after this talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So who would like to participate in the Q&A section here? Please repeat the questions that people are asking. So,
hi. So I'm very involved with accessibility for Jupyter, and I think accessibility might be a space where it's actually not so hard to figure out what kinds of community feedback we need to gather, but it can be a little nerve-wracking to invest in gathering that feedback when we don't necessarily feel like we have the resources to turn around and take action on it. And so I'm wondering if you have any suggestions for that stage of things.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So the question is, when it comes to usability feedback, that is, it's important that that feedback gets incorporated into designs. How do we communicate when we are not sure if those things can be incorporated or not? Is that a good?
How do we ensure that those things do get
Yeah, how do we ensure that those things do get incorporated? And then I would add, how do you manage that relationship in the meantime if things can't happen right away? So I think we have an old saying at work of "don't lie and tell them why." So it's a really good principle of the realities of product development, open source projects. We can't guarantee that anything's going to happen on any specific timeline. So we have public roadmaps that we use that really articulate when we'll have time for a particular activity. So it could be something general like accessibility refresh or something like that, just to give people a timeline in their mind. And then we have, the way that we get feedback from folks is they're part of a user research pool. So we have ongoing connection and conversations with them to let them know where we are in the process. So I would say over communicate, and then where I get stuck is making sure that your project leadership or any decision makers understand the investment of time and resources up front before going to those groups. Yeah.
I'll first go over here.
Hello, I'm Jen. I'm a UX designer. I was wondering, you were talking about community, I forget the term, like community engagement and it sounded like you were talking a lot about engagement in maybe online communities or teaching, so the developers and designers don't always have to directly get involved for every question. Do you have any examples of that kind of community work, but more for design, like UX design or visual design, like a way of getting people involved without having to directly engage them in a usability test or a survey, some other way of getting people to contribute systematically?
Yeah, so these are how to get open source designers involved in other open source projects? Or does that? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, I'm happy to sort of like talk about like open source design is a big, large community where people can connect with each other who are working on open source design. And then part of my fellowship and part of this work with Super Bloom is like, should there be a place that's more specifically for designers in scientific computing to start to share patterns, which is another area where I think kind of where your question was going of like, how do we answer each other's questions? I feel like I missed the point. I'm sorry. Do you mind? I don't want to miss because I feel like you have a good question.
Sure. So I think you were talking about kind of community forums where people in the community, let's say someone asks a question, you don't have to be on the development team to answer it. Someone else in the community can answer it. So getting people involved without, like setting up a system where people can get involved easily. And I think that works for education pretty well. We have these standard ways of doing that. But I'm wondering for design, like how can we, do you have any thoughts or have you seen anything work where you can get people involved in design without having to directly reach out and ask questions?
Okay. Like, yes. So we have we do crowdsourcing on design challenges. So we have internal and external portals. Like if we have a specific design challenge. So right now we have implementation of Jupyter Notebooks, but we also do workspace management. So one of our current design challenges is how do we optimize workspace management that fits for our users. So we have designers, we have researchers themselves, we have administrators, all commenting on those ways to solve the problem. So it's more of like a crowdsourcing effort. And I can't speak to specific projects, but I know in open source community, there's also like the discussions forum and issues where you can see a lot of that design dialogue happening. Yeah.
What are successful open source projects that you know that have included UX UI design as a priority of the project?
Do you have examples? Yeah, live examples, yeah. What, do you want to shout it out?
Can we first repeat the question?
Oh, the question is, what are success stories of good open source projects that have good design? And I'm speaking to Errol and Katie because they talked to a few of them in the project.
A good historic one to look at, which is successful but also complicated, is how Mozilla did their open design process for their rebranding. If you're curious about rebranding specifically, but the dynamics of how to involve design communities within like something complicated like how to make decisions about what your project should look like and do, that's really good. And the blogs are fantastic. And if you look at Mozilla Open Design, it's good. But there are a number of different projects that have design resource in-house, like paid now. So like Ushahidi still has, which is not a scientific one, still has a lot of design happening. The Open Food Network does. A lot of Civi CRM is pretty good. Actually, they have a really small but healthy like design like matrix channel and a lot of really good chatter. And also between like the coding side of things and the design side of things, there's a really lovely synergy between like the two in Civi CRM. I'm still learning about scientific open source software, so I don't have specific examples there, but I'm sure that there are.
Any more questions?
Hello there. So I work in product and community, so tons of the slides there. I'm like, I've got to read that. I've got to read that. I've got to read that. So thank you. So my particular question is about trying to engage feedback from the people who are actually doing scientific research, who are often graduate students and postdocs who are new to the discipline. So when you ask, what are your problems? How can we help you? They don't know because they're learning everything and are often overly influenced by a few voices, like, well, my supervisor told me I had to do it this way, so I guess I should do it this way. And that perpetuates like solving the problem the way we would have solved it 20 years ago. Any suggestions or advice on how to elicit a better conversation with those junior researchers who actually are the ones I want to serve?
Yeah, definitely time intensive and resource intensive, and it's not listed on the slide.
Excuse me,
but
can you quickly repeat the question?
Sorry. So the question is the methods that we can use to elicit feedback from junior researchers who often are, they don't have a lot of autonomy and they might be afraid to share for all sorts of politics. So one of the things we do, we just started researcher lab visits. So we go in person and do an ethnographic, fly on the wall, 5-day diary study. So we could do diary studies or we could do in person where you're not even really asking them, you're just sort of observing how they're doing and then building in the trust, building in the confidence, and then starting to elicit that feedback. So we have a user research team that's really dedicated to going a little deeper and making it a little bit safer. We're also thinking about what do you call, like special interest groups where it's early career researchers only. So trying to create that space as well. But like I said, it has to be designed. It can't be off the rails. And we often talk to PIs of like, hey, this is what we're going to do. So I would say it's a little bit skewed toward the PIs who are willing to have that interaction. Yeah, but that's one way. Yeah.
Okay, unfortunately, time's up. So if there are any more questions, please reach out to the speaker directly. And thank you, everyone, for attending the talk.